currently working in the non-profit sector. I'm a recent graduate from a Bachelor degree in Political Science. I got involved with FSG mainly because of FSG, who had this amazing initiative, this amazing idea of bringing all these people together so we could discuss ideas and bounce off each other, see what needs to be done for the country. With that in mind, this is like my presentation is kind of a very intro one-on-one, what is innovation sort of thing. For a lot of us, we'll just lay the groundwork for more discussions that will happen in the course of the session. So without further ado, let's move on to the presentation. I'd like to start with an example. Unfortunately, it's not very clear on the board, but you can see it's a boat. But it's not just any boat. It's actually garner energy from the sun, which they use to power things like computers and fans, etc., inside the boat. And this has been nominated for an award at the World Innovation Summit in Education in Doha, Qatar. And this is like sort of inside the boat, where you see like there is a classroom, there are books, shelves, everything. There's even a blackboard. So why is this innovative? Because in Bangladesh, one of the main problems is pressure on land is extremely high. There are too many people, not enough space. Moreover, to make matters worse, we have floods almost all the time, especially people who live by the riverbanks. They're worst affected. So a lot of kids can't go to school regularly because whenever there's a flood, their schools are flooded. So what do you do? This NGO, which you can see, it's not very clear, but it's Shigulai Shonirbhor Shongstha. They came up with this idea of if the kids can't go to school, why don't we bring the school to the kids? So they install the solar power panels on the boats, and they essentially have books. It's all made through donations, and they have employed teachers, and essentially they pick up kids from different villages, bring them to these boats, and then provide the education which they can get from the schools. So as you can see, there are more pictures of the indoor, and this is each boat has space for about 30 students. And as well as internet and PC, the boat also has a well-stocked library, as you can see the bottom picture. So this is what we're talking about. This is innovation, right? And this is happening right in Bangladesh. So now moving from the example to a definition of what exactly innovation is. In very simple terms, innovation is people creating value by implementing new ideas. So essentially, this is the equation of innovation, where you see it's a combination of ideation of the idea you can actually put into practice. And this is sort of a breakdown, a mathematical breakdown of what goes into the innovation process. So how exactly does it happen? There are different approaches of doing so. Some people have a modifying approach, who essentially try to refine and improve existing platforms and existing frameworks. So people go into visioning, who like to imagine an ideal future, like to do new things and completely change the existing structure. Some people explore, who like to question assumptions that we have about things the way they are and how they can be changed. Where others just like to experiment, kind of see if you can test various combinations of new ideas and see if those work. And that's kind of how the different approaches, which essentially is a fancy way of saying you can either create a new market or you can manage the existing markets. So if you create new markets, it's kind of like very high risk, high reward, obviously, because you're like the new entrants. There's not much competition to begin with. And you also have to bring about radical technological change, which is kind of a given. Whereas if you go into existing markets, it's more about modifying the customer experience, giving them a better product maybe, but not something radically new. And you essentially don't have to innovate in terms of technology that much. But they're both ways in which you innovate to improve the end result. So now, why innovate? So we talked about what it is and why should we need it. In the context of Bangladesh, it's actually very important because we as a country are very dependent on certain sectors. Essentially, we depend on governments and we depend on remittance from people who live abroad. But there isn't really much innovation going on. As a result, if there's a global shock, we're going to be worse affected. Because if, for example, some countries change their labor laws and we can't export laborers anymore, then what happens to our GDP? What happens to our economy? What happens if, because we no longer enjoy the privileges we currently have in the global market in terms of governments? What if countries no longer give us favored export benefits? So in that situation, we need to innovate. We need to come up with new ideas of modifying economy, new ideas of inputting resources and getting maximum output from them. So if you can see, let's
believe in the dots they see every day.
That's something we'll go into later. Okay. Right. So from a global perspective, innovation essentially is critical to economic change. It's a driver of social development, obviously, because the more new ideas you can come up with production and of maximizing your output, the better it is for your economy. And obviously, if, for instance, in the future, as the population grows further, there will be an explosion of interest in social innovation, which is already happening in balance, which is great, because we have all these development NGOs doing amazing stuff, but we need more of them. And also, the last point is a brand barrier, because what happens essentially in the country is local people have this approach that local brands are not good enough. And if this is not just limited to local brands, even with global brands, they're not as powerful as they used to be. You're no longer as committed to one product of a particular brand as you used to be, say, 15 years ago, because you have so many more choices. So in this situation, it's essential that you keep innovating. As this says, technology is changing fast, new products come from new competitors, production lifetimes shorter, and the need to replace the product sooner. Essentially sums up the main problems we have with the production process right now. And also products are very difficult to differentiate. You have like 50 different types of soaps, 20 different types of e-book readers. Which one do you pick and what exactly differentiates them? The boundaries are becoming more and more obscure and not as clear-cut, which is where innovation comes in. Because you have to stay in the market, you have to innovate and make sure that your product has that competitive edge. And obviously, customers are also becoming more sophisticated. Since they have more choice, they obviously demand more. And markets are forming and changing fast. A market for a product might exist now in a particular country, in a particular place, but it might not be the case later when the situation changes. So keeping all those things in mind is absolutely essential. We innovate and keep changing things to keep pace with the global changes. This is not a surprise. Kind of a layout of the most innovative companies in the world. As you can see, like the big names are there. Samsung, Intel, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Disney, Sony, whatnot. There's a reason why these companies are the best. Because they essentially have a huge investment in research and development, and they know the importance of innovating and keep innovating over time. There's a very important quote from Bill Gates in this case. He said that to be innovative, you cannot be afraid to obsolete your own products. If you are, others will obsolete them for you. So unless you keep innovating, someone else will do it and take the market from you. So it's essentially keep doing that on your own. This is kind of a timeline of how Google innovated over the years. You can see it was never just Google. It kept adding all these different things. You know, there was AdWords, there's Picasa, there's Gmail got all these different outlooks over time. They have like Dodgeball, Google Apps, SketchUp, all these different things, Android also. So these things kept happening over the years in spite of the fact that Google is so strong and it's a huge market. They never stopped innovating. Even today, if you go, you'll see something new being added every week or every month. So that's essentially the key to a successful company. So moving from like a micro, a farm-based perspective to a whole economy, a macro perspective, even from the GDP perspective of a country, it's essential that the country as a whole keeps innovating. So we see like all these countries towards the top, like no surprises, like Switzerland, Singapore, you know, Finland, they have the Global Innovation Index essentially measures how innovative you are. So they're very innovative and also their GDP per capita is very high. So it's not just a coincidence that these things are linked. So essentially, Bangladesh is right, like, I can't point on the board, but it's towards the bottom right now, towards the 1600 figure, but it needs to move from there really fast. Because a lot of countries like Guyana and Paraguay and Ecuador, which aren't really that rich, are innovating fast, and essentially their GDP is moving fast as well. Reverse innovation is something that's happening in a lot of developing countries, and it's happening in Bangladesh as well. You might not know this, but Gatorade energy drink, which a lot of people in the US and the developing world use right now, actually it originated in Bangladesh. Not in Gatorade, obviously, not in that name, but it's what people used to feed children or people who are sick when Bangladesh had a huge cholera outbreak. So US doctors came to Bangladesh and they saw this like huge like sort of liquid concoctions with salt and different things were being used to feed people and they were recovering, and they thought that we can actually use this to feed our athletes and people who have like high activity to make up for their salt intake. So this is how kind of innovation that started in a developing country moved to a developed country. So that's essentially the reverse. It's somewhere when it comes to implementation that we're lacking. This is kind of a sort of where we need to focus right now. There needs to be economic and industrial policy reform. Regional obvious barriers are, we have this culture of risk aversion. Something works, let's just stick with that. Why try something new but it's risky? But we can't do that because the world will keep innovating and we'll just keep following. So the dots will somehow connect in your future. And by dots, we talk about different things we come across in our lives every day. The different things we look at, different ideas that come to our head which we don't necessarily capitalize on. So what's the difference between a normal person and an innovator? So any on that note, this is a quote from Richard Bach, that everything you see and touch was once an invisible idea until someone chose to bring it into being. Any powerful idea is absolutely fascinating and absolutely useless